So we have seen new developments with two of the most reliable computer models, GFS and the European model, and now the Ensemble members are shifting their forecast a little bit further westward and a little bit further southward, which is a little bit more concerning since that does bring it a little bit closer to the Caribbean islands as well as the United States, but still a long way to go when it comes to this forecast. And as of right now, at least, both of the computer models aren't necessarily taking direct impacts, but it's always concerning when we see a trend where the forecast continues ahead a little bit further westward. And when we're talking about a forecast that's this far out, there's still definitely plenty of time for potentially that trend to continue to head further westward, and hopefully it doesn't end up going as far westward to where it could impact land, but it's too early to say for certain. And the reason being why we're seeing that shift a little bit further westward is because the GFS and the European model have been detecting that there's going to be a little bit more ridging than initially anticipated. So instead of the GFS model wanting to take this straight northward, just right as it approaches just north of Leeward Islands, it's taking a little bit of a different approach as of the latest 18Z run, where it goes a little bit further westward and a little bit further southward like we see right here. There's enough ridging that's going to steer this a little bit further westward, and it doesn't expect the troughing to be as strong over the northern Atlantic, which is a little bit more concerning. So if it gets past this stage, the big question remains beyond this stage: will there be enough troughing to steer this out to sea? And when we're talking about a forecast that's beyond 150 hours out, that's very difficult to determine, but based on what the GFS model is stating, at least as of right now, it does eventually expect the troughing to be strong enough, but we see it does come uncomfortably close to the coast of North Carolina and in general the entirety of the mid-Atlantic and even New England, where of course rip currents, and I wouldn't even be surprised in a scenario like this where we see isolated coastal flooding events, since this storm will be very powerful. So even if you're far from the center of circulation, you're gonna experience impacts more so when it comes to those strong wave heights, as well as the fact that they're in the more vulnerable areas. Maybe you could see some coastal flooding, but of course the rip current risk will be very high and dangerous in a scenario like this. But still too far out to say if it'll take a track like this. The big hope is that this troughing over eastern Canada is strong enough, and that still has yet to be seen there, because there easily could be that possibility the ridging could potentially block this from interacting with this trough, or potentially just weaken this trough enough to where, in the unfortunate case, would bring this a little bit further westward to the United States. And even before the United States, there maybe could be a little bit more ridging than anticipated, where it could potentially brush some of the northern coasts of the Caribbean islands. That's still not out of the realm of possibilities either. I just want to make sure you guys are aware of any possibility that could occur, because we're still far out. It's not so cut and dry that it's going to necessarily move out to sea. There's still a lot of time remaining to really get a good idea of what's going to happen. But we have been seeing that trend further westward. We're going to need to pay very close attention to that continues over the next few hours. And even the European model, like I said, has been trending a little bit further westward and southward as well. We see in a scenario like this, it isn't as strong as the GFS model, but we still see that same amount of ridging that's steering it a little bit further westward. And if this trough ends up being weak enough, we could see that even move even more westward. So definitely keep that in mind over the next few days. Regardless, though, I am expecting a high rip current risk along the United States coast, whether this moves out to sea or whether this moves a little bit closer. You're going to experience a high rip current risk when we're talking about a storm system that's this powerful. Taking a look at how powerful this storm system is expected to be, we're down to 950 millibars here, which is equivalent to around a Category 4 hurricane at this point. And even if it's hundreds of miles off the coast, that would bring a very dangerous rip current risk. And I emphasize all throughout the coast, don't swim in a scenario like this. Rip currents are extremely dangerous. You definitely don't want to mess around with that. If you're heated to not swim in the water, make sure to just straight up not swim, because it's going to be very, very dangerous with those rip currents, even if there's hundreds of miles off the coast. In terms of anything else that could happen, like I said, still too early to say. We're going to need to pay close attention to the ridging, but this storm is expected to be quite powerful, strengthening into Category 3 strength, even though the strengthening should be rather slow, at least initially. And like I mentioned, the reason why is due to the stronger amount of wind shear it's going to experience, at least early on. There's a stronger amount of upper level winds that is going to at least keep this storm from rapidly intensifying, at least initially. And another thing I must point out is that the water temperatures, at least initially, aren't necessarily going to be very warm. And in fact, it's going to move over water that's a little bit under the 80 degree threshold. So that's why it's going to at least struggle a bit when it comes to strengthening. But we see what's ahead of it, just very warm waters approaching the mid to upper 80s by the time we approach just north of the Caribbean islands, as that certainly will give this storm plenty of fuel to rapidly intensify by the time this approaches closer to the Caribbean. And like I said in my previous video, the wind shear will also wind down. There's going to be plenty of moisture and not enough dry air around it. It's just going to be a perfect recipe for this to likely develop into a major hurricane just north of the Caribbean. Here's a quick look at the European ensemble members, and at least for the good news is that still a vast majority of them, almost all of them, still want to take this out to sea. So that is certainly good news. Hopefully that trend continues, but it has shifted further westward, which isn't necessarily good news. But like I said in my previous video, just because most of the ensemble members have been taking this out to sea does not mean that'll be the case when we're talking about a forecast that's this far out into the future. Of course, this would be the best case scenario, but this, by the time it approaches this vicinity right here, we're talking about a forecast that's around 6 to 7 days out, which is just too far to really get a good idea, especially of what's going to happen with how the steering flows will build, because already we're seeing a pretty significant update with the computer models, and it's only been 24 hours because a lot of the computer models before were taking this much further out to sea. Now that curve is a little bit closer to the United States, which is a pretty big significant difference in only a 24-hour period. So I emphasize, guys, still keep an eye on this throughout the United States as well as Caribbean, because I definitely think we could easily see this move a little bit further westward if this trend continues on. So definitely don't let your guard down just yet. Another thing outside of the ridging that I think could affect the potential steering of this storm system is the strength of it initially. And this might sound counterintuitive, but it might be better for this storm to intensify a little bit earlier and a little bit quicker. And the reason being is that if it were to do that, more of the upper level winds would be able to take hold of this storm system, and the upper level winds would want to steer this a little bit further northward, while a weaker storm system, it'll have a shorter circulation, so the upper level winds won't have as much of an impact, and it'll be more so the surface level winds that would steer this storm system. And the surface level winds will take this further westward, and if we see a weaker storm, we're more likely to see this move a little bit further westward, a little bit further southward, and that could play a big role, because the longer it stays further southward, the more likely in general it is to likely, of course, move further westward, and for the ridging to build a little bit more for this to move a little bit further westward, which would certainly be the worst case scenario. As of right now, we see that that this storm does become strong enough to where it does take that trek further northward, but we are going to have to wait and see how the strength of this storm system plays out over the next few days. We see that there's going to be wind shear initially before we'd eventually see this upper level high gonna build right over this storm system, removing the wind shear and creating a nice outflow for this storm system to rapidly intensify, as that seems to be in good agreement at this time. So definitely be prepared for that strong rip current risk all throughout the coast. And here's the current projected path from the National Hurricane Center. We see that this is eventually expected to reach hurricane status by the time we approach the Wednesday time frame, right around Wednesday afternoon, before it's expected to reach major hurricane status by the time we approach this weekend, just north of the Caribbean islands. And we see a pretty large area where this storm could move into, where if it were to take the, let's say, the worst case scenario, the most southward track, this will definitely bring tropical storm force impacts to the Leeward Islands as well as the Puerto Rico area, which would definitely be concerning. And we also need to keep in mind that only 2/3 of the time tropical cyclones stay within the cone of uncertainty. So there's still a 1/3 of a chance that this storm system could even move beyond the cone of uncertainty. So definitely keep that in mind as well when taking a look at these forecasts. But this projected path is the most likely scenario where the storm will move into. Of course, beyond this, it does become a big question mark. Really all depends on how much ridging there is and how strong that Eastern Canadian low pressure system will be, because if it ends up being weak enough, we could see that unfortunate scenario where this does move further westward and directly impacts the United States. So definitely stay tuned for that. Pay close attention to that low pressure system as it moves through Canada over the next few days, and just determine just see how strong it gets. The stronger that low pressure system ends up being, the better it is for pretty much the entirety of the United States as well as the Caribbean even. So definitely pay close attention to that over the next few days. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.